Okay, now I'd like just to introduce Mick Keogh. He needs no introduction, we all know him very well. Mick, just on behalf of Derek, we thank you for your work and the fact that you've always been open with us and given us the opportunity to meet with you, and come along and spoken to our members a number of times, and we really do appreciate that. So I'll just hand it over to you, and you can give us an update on where you're at. Thank you.
Thanks very much, George. You make it sound like I come along voluntarily, whereas anyone who knows Sean would know that it's not so much a voluntary as a when can you appear and how long can you last, which is good. That's what an advocacy organisation needs. So I shouldn't complain about that. And having had past experience in similar roles, it's sometimes necessary to be encouraging of visitors and participants in particular processes. So that's what you need. I thought I'd just touch on a couple of points. I don't have any formal notes or a presentation. What I wanted to mention was some work we've been doing in relation to the unfair contract terms law, and you may have seen some announcements about that in the last week or so. So I just thought I'd go over that a little bit. I did also want to touch on the ACCC's role in the development of the mandatory code, just to make sure we're clear on that. And there's a couple of other issues have come up, as we understand it, around the issue of the mandatory code. So I might touch on those if I get a chance towards the end. So firstly, just to talk about our role in the unfair contract terms law. So this was a bit of legislation that the government introduced in November 2016. It's called the Business to Business Unfair Contract Terms Law. And it basically says if you're a large business offering standard form contracts, in other words, take it or leave it contracts, to a small business or to consumers, well, the consumers are already covered in a previous law, but if you're a large business offering standard form contracts to small businesses, and those small businesses were defined by less than 300,000 value of a contract annually or $1 million in multi-years, less than 20 full-time equivalent employees on a headcount basis. So if the business you were dealing with, if you're a large business and the business you were dealing with fitted within that category, then the law basically said if you offer them a standard form contract and it's got what we call unfair terms in it, in other words unbalanced terms, then the court can declare those terms to be void. So the court doesn't cancel the contract, the court simply says that particular term is unenforceable under this contract. So what happened when that legislation was introduced, we indicated there would be a 12-month moratorium before the ACCC started to become more active in looking at that particular issue and the problems associated with that. So we did that. So at the start of 2018, we started doing some more detailed work on that. Because, and I think most of you will understand this, the view of the ACCC generally is there's not much good having a law without anything happening as a consequence of that law, that follow-up enforcement. So we don't, our general approach is not to charge out and book the first person we see, unlike the parking police around here. Our general approach is to say, all right, for 12 months we're going to make sure everyone understands what's going on, or 18 months, whatever the time is, and then we'll start to be more selective. So that's the process that's occurred. So over the last 12 months, and I guess as a consequence of the information gained in our dairy inquiry, we've been dealing with all the major processors, the major dairy processors in Australia, and going through their contracts. Now, as you in this audience would well understand, some of those processors have a dozen or more different sorts of contracts they offer. So it hasn't been, some people would say, well, why in the hell didn't you get that done a lot quicker? Well, the issue is that it's not just a single contract for each processor, it's in fact multiple contracts for each processor. And then the law requires us to look at the terms and decide whether they're unfair, and then they're only judged unfair if they're not necessary for the purposes of the contract. So you can imagine a situation, for example, where a contract had a huge penalty for someone leaving before the term of the contract expired, and you'd say, well, that sounds unfair, but then it might be that they're guaranteed a particular price for the term of that contract or whatever. So there's this balancing act that occurs as part of the process. So we've had a very detailed, we've had our legal team in Brisbane involved in that over a 12-month period. And the way we've had to operate is to go to those processes and say, well, on the face of it, these terms in your contracts are unfair because they put an obligation on one party that's not matched, or they confer rights on one party that's not matched by the other. And that's involved to and fro, with the processors explaining why they thought it was essential, etc., and some judgment calls. But that process is now essentially complete, and you may have seen the publicity around that last week, where we reached resolution with most of those processes. We still have two that are the subject of some ongoing discussions. One's Saputo, the other's Bega, but they're broadly in line with where we wanted them to be. So the sorts of issues we were looking at were what we called unilateral price variations. So particularly on a multi-year contract, in other words, where you're locked in to supply for 3 or 5 years, where the processor imposed a penalty for leaving that contract before the term, but at the same time retained the right to vary the price throughout that contract. That's what we call a unilateral price variation. So we judged that that was unfair, and mostly what the processors agreed to was a situation where they have to give you 30 days notice if they're changing the price, and during that period you have the opportunity to depart that contract without penalty. So that's the sort of thing we're talking about. The second area we were talking about was what we called a unilateral variation to other conditions. In other words, not price, but some of the other parameters around what the contract involved. So this applied in particular where you had a written contract, and that contract was subject to the requirements laid out in the supplier handbook, and the processor reserved the right to supply, to vary the conditions of the supplier handbook whenever they felt like it. So in effect that meant that, for example, if they changed the quality parameters, they could do that by the supplier handbook. You were still locked in, and even if you were disadvantaged by that, you had no opportunity to exit without a penalty. So again, that was one area of the sorts of contract clauses that were deemed unfair, and that has now been changed for most of them. And I think there's a couple of them still working through it, because obviously some of them had multi-year contracts that didn't necessarily come up for renewal, and so there was a question of when they had to go about making that change. In one case, rather than go through the process of changing the wording of the contract and getting them re-signed, the processor agreed to issue a letter specifying that they would not give effect to those particular clauses in that contract for the duration of those contracts, and then obviously when they're up for renewal, those clauses will be changed in the new ones. The third area we looked at was the extended notice periods for termination. Some were up to 12 months, and of course it's pretty hard to give 12 months notice of your intention to terminate when you may not even know whether there's a price available or another processor to go to over that length of period of time. So we've generally had those changed. The possible exception well, there's two possible exceptions. One is in Western Australia, where the 12 months notice applied to both. So in other words, if the processor wanted to stop picking up for the supplier, they had to give 12 months notice. So therefore, if the supplier wanted to leave, the processor they had to give the processor 12 months notice. So where, if you can see what I mean there, where the obligations and responsibilities on both parties were balanced, then that was okay. In the other instance, the other issue was contract conditions that limited the ability of the supplier to lease the land or sell the land while they remained a supplier. And again, this was a tricky one because I guess, as the dairy farmers in the room would know, if you got to the point of wanting to sell your dairy farm and you had associated with it a secured supply contract, then obviously it's worth more to sell a dairy farm with a supply contract associated with it than it is to sell a dairy farm without. So there were some negotiations around that, and I think the wording now arrived at that looks likely to be more acceptable is, in those situations, it has to be mutually agreed by both parties when they enter into the contract that that limit on transferring or selling the property can be included in the contract, and it requires the wording in there that the processor would not oppose the sale of that contract on any of that land on any reasonable basis. So there's sufficient words in there, we think, to give some comfort to dairy farmers that clause won't be enacted unless there's a particular reason why it should be. So that work, I think, has been good in cleaning up some of those issues. And I must admit, we've had people say to us, well, why do we need to worry about a mandatory dairy code? You guys can go and use the unfair contract terms law to sort these things out. And my response to that is, under the unfair contract terms law, there is nothing legally stopping those processors rewriting those terms back into their contracts next year. If they did, and someone brought it to our attention, all we can do is go to them and say, well, if you don't take this clause out, we'll get a court to strike it out. But that's all we can do. And so I just really want to make the point to those currently engaged in discussions about the dairy code that whilst I think this work has been useful, and processors, I want to be honest, processors have generally been quite cooperative in coming to the party and understanding why these contracts shouldn't have these clauses in them anymore. So I think that has been useful, but I just really want to make the point that if you think that this is a substitute for code, the problem is that the way the law works, we could go and do it all again next year if the processors decide to put those clauses back. Yep.
Quick one, Mick. You mentioned right at the start contracts of value under 300,000. I don't think there'd be a dairy farm in this room that would qualify.
No, and we're fortunate in that there's a quirk in the law in that it basically implies that if you can't accurately establish the value of the contract, it's deemed to fall within the parameters for the small business contract. So that hasn't been tested. It could be tested, and we may find that it doesn't apply. But because the processors had at least, certainly in the northern market, some of the processors had at least some of their suppliers under that 300 annual threshold, and the fact that in a lot of cases in the southern markets, there's not a price written into the contract. That meant there was enough uncertainty that we could take advantage of that to include dairy contracts in it. And that unfair contract terms law is up for review at the moment, and one of the issues is the need to increase that threshold. So
typically we'd be having to look at something like $2 million. I know you can't comment, but we should probably ask.
Yeah, and that's the sort of discussion that's happening at the moment, and not just. I mean, you may have noticed we had a lot of activity in the waste removal area. So the companies that supply the bins at the bottom of this building that I mean, they had, some of the contracts they had put the dairy industry to shame. Processors haven't been trying really. They had contracts that basically said, if you don't give a 6 months notice of your intention to discontinue, then the penalty for discontinuing is the equivalent of the cost of 12 months of service. So your processors were just, you know, they're really only in the kiddie pool. They're not. They're not serious. Anyway, but I really do want to emphasise that point that I think this has been a useful exercise and a good starting point. But I don't think anyone should be under the misimpression that this means that, well, we don't need a code. We can just rely on this unfair contract terms law as a mechanism to keep contracts in balance. So I think that is quite important, a point to make. The second issue, obviously, that's very topical at the moment is the dairy mandatory code, the proposed mandatory code that we recommended as part of the inquiry outcomes. And in fact, I think the UCT work we've done has probably confirmed to us the fact that in the absence of a mandatory code, these issues are going to be ongoing, and they will invariably crop up again inevitably into the future. The advantage of a code is if there is a breach, then straight away we can issue an infringement notice or start prosecution, and there's actually a penalty associated with the breach of that code. So we can take action and do something about it when a problem arises, but also that's a major disincentive for anyone who wants to consider, any processor who wants to consider bending the rules a bit. So I think that's the critical difference that a code makes. It means that instead of this enormous effort of going around for 12 months and engaging in great detail with every individual processor, you establish a benchmark, so to speak, a line which basically says don't go beyond this, and if there are breaches you can take action fairly quickly to create a disincentive to do it again. So I just make that point to you because I know that will come up in debate. The further point I would make is, and just to be clear, the ACCC isn't currently involved in the development or the consultation process associated with the development of the mandatory code. That's purely a role for government. The Department of Agriculture is doing that, and the process obviously is underway with meetings and consultations. We are kept up to date with some of the process and anticipate that at the end of January the first draft of the government's proposed mandatory code will come our way for comment. But I do want to make the point that whilst we recommended a mandatory code, it is essentially a process of government to develop that code, and then of course, as you've probably or may have been made aware, they also have to develop a regulatory impact statement which basically says, well, here's what we think the advantages of this are and here's what it's likely to cost, and that's the way the government approaches this stuff. So I'm not trying to duck anything, but I just want to make sure you're aware that in terms of the current workshops and consultative process that's underway, we're not directly involved at this stage. Once they've got to a draft, we anticipate they usually flick it past us for comment, and then my understanding is they'll make it available to the industry for comment, and at that stage start to do what they call the regulatory impact statement. So that's the key message on that. Just while we're on it, I think some of the messages that are coming out of those consultations are some of the ones we addressed in relation to the dairy report, but obviously they keep coming up. One is this question of, well, why wouldn't the mandatory dairy code also include the supermarkets? And I think as Christian would probably inform you, the supermarkets already have their code, the food and grocery code. That's also subject to review at the moment, so we're all getting the cleaners put through us. And that deals with the relationship between, for example, the processors and the supermarkets. So it's not appropriate then to have a code like the dairy code overlapping, because that of course wouldn't work very well in all sorts of ways. So the response very clearly is the dairy code as proposed deals with the relationships between dairy farmers and processors, not further on down the supply chain, because that's already covered. The second point that I've found interesting is I've certainly seen some commentary in relation to cost, and some commentary suggesting there will be significant cost for dairy farmers associated with having a mandatory code in place. All I can say is that I suggest those who are worried about that talk to their colleagues in the horticulture industry, because the horticulture industry has had a mandatory code now for about 6 years. And well, I don't want to bias the debate, and as I said, we're not involved in the process at this stage, but I would suggest that those in the horticulture industry would express some surprise if the argument was put to them that the horticulture code has imposed significant costs at the farm level. I think even the traders involved in the horticulture industry in some of their weaker moments have suggested that the improvements in paperwork associated with compliance with the code have actually been an advantage to their businesses as well. They didn't have paperwork in place previously, and of course that led to a lot of arguments that have subsequently been cleaned up to some extent by the requirement to have contracts in place. Mind you, I don't think you would ever get rid of arguments in the horticulture sector about whether the trader or the farmer has got the advantage of the situation. So, Sean, they were the main points that I just thought was worth making, and a bit of discussion in general, because there may have been some, certainly, information around that release we put out last week about the changes in the contracts. And I don't know, some of you may have experienced communications from your processors in response to that, but happy to take questions. George is happy to take questions.
I'm not happy to take questions. Any questions for me? Yes, Steve.
Just one question. Well, it's not really a question so much, maybe a comment. But I was talking to a processor, a person who works for a processor recently, and they were making the comment that the processor was going to a lot of trouble in the legal field to make sure that their contracts were compliant with ACCC. And I said, well, are they plain English contracts? And this person said to me, no, they're more complicated.
You're touching on an issue which is more broadly a challenge we face, and I'll go back to basics. The notion of free market and competition is, of course, that the consumers in that, or the suppliers in that, have access to good information about the prices on offer and can make a choice. Of course, what we've seen in electricity, in telcos, in banking, in insurance, in dairy, in beef, is these contracts that are getting more and more complicated and more opaque and more difficult to either understand or compare. And that is a phenomenon we're seeing. So if you look at your electricity contract, or it's the same deal, and it's a deliberate strategy on behalf of particularly those supplying standard products or buying standard products to create a lack of clarity in the market and therefore soften competition. And it's an abiding issue right across a lot of markets in Australia. One of our recommendations that hadn't been picked up to any great extent that tried to address that was that we should have some standard dairy farm profiles and the ability to compare the pricing and the contracts being offered against those standard profiles. So you could actually say, well, here's a seasonal milker with 300 cows, this level of butterfat, etc., and compare all the processes about what that return would mean. I mean, unfortunately, that recommendation hasn't been taken up, but it's something we're seeing. We're seeing it in the insurance market, exactly the same thing. That, there's so many complications around exactly what contract you're taking out that it's almost impossible to compare the prices. So the recommendation is no, there should be just a standard basic contract, and each should be required to offer that and spell out the costs. So I understand the problem you're talking about. It's not an easy one to get a solution to, because of course processors would argue, well, we want to be able to provide incentives for non-seasonal milk, or we want to be able to provide incentives for lower somatic count or whatever. And so we can't avoid that, but you're right, getting a plain English, easy to understand contract, or one that you can certainly compare between processors is a real challenge.
Right.
Things going along again today, Mick. I know we're fairly persistent, but we
I didn't think I had a choice.
I suppose, as I alluded to earlier today, that the debate going on in regard to the cost of the implementation of the Military Code is probably similar to the debate we saw with the introduction of GST. And I hope that was a correct alignment, because I think most people probably after the introduction of GST, our paperwork and our bookwork's been a lot better, and I think people actually appreciated that in the longer term. I haven't heard anyone complain about it for a heck of a long time, but sort of fear and emotion are very strong tools, but probably the challenge for us as an advocacy group is to get that message out there, and we think it's important that a clear message goes out about that cost, and we are struggling a little bit with that at the moment.
Well, and that's what I find curious, because certainly in the northern markets, my impression as we went around was it's much more common for, in fact, both parties to have a written contract. In contrast to the Victorian and the southern markets, where it's an understanding that's not been written down up until now. But my understanding is in the northern markets, it's generally the case that there's some form of paperwork exchanged between the two parties, in which case you would be, and this is taking on the horticulture industry, you would be 100% compliant with the code. So the entire cost in terms of the farmer is, I've got to have a contract in place and keep a copy of it. So for the life of me, I cannot understand this argument about this code will impose significant costs, particularly at the farm gate. It may mean that processors have to get in place decent record keeping, and as Christian has alluded to, if we come looking for those records, there may be a cost in finding them and retrieving them and making them available. But again, I still struggle to understand, and sure, we haven't seen what the code is actually going to say, but I struggle to understand where this argument about substantial cost has come from, given the experience in other industries.
Thanks. Any further questions? Thanks, Mick, and again, a little token of our appreciation for making time to come and
I think I've got about 3 of these.
Yes. That's one of your favourites.
You're going to have to up your standard. Some fermented mare's milk. No, thank you all.
No, thanks.